Your hand finds the phone before your eyes open. 3 inches from the nightstand, thumb already moving, screen light hitting your face in the dark. You haven't stood up. You haven't taken one breath on purpose. And already, some small vote has been cast about how the next 16 hours will go.
This is not really about the phone. It's about the fact that this happens most mornings, in some version or another, and you've stopped noticing. A flinch dressed up as a habit. A reach for information before you've even asked yourself how you feel. Multiply that flinch by every hour of every day, and you get a life that runs on reaction, built by a person who never once decided to build it that way. What follows is not a lesson in thinking positive thoughts, and it will not ask you to meditate your way out of a mortgage. It's an argument, made slowly and without flattery, that the static running underneath your days is not random. It has a source, and the source has been available to you the entire time. You have spent years trying to fix your circumstances one at a time. The job, the relationship, the body, the bank account. Nobody told you that the circumstances were never the ones in charge. Based on the book In Tune with the Infinite by Ralph Waldo Trine, and adapted into narrative format to make its ideas practical and engaging. Chapter 1. The Static Beneath the Noise. You've been hearing it for years. You just learned to call it something else. You know the sound already, even if no one has ever pointed at it directly. It's there in the 2 minutes after you close your laptop for the night, when the room goes quiet and something in your chest doesn't. It's there on a Sunday afternoon when nothing is wrong, nothing is due, and you still can't sit still long enough to finish a cup of coffee. You call it stress. You call it being busy. You call it just how things are now. But underneath all 3 of those names is the same low, constant hum, and you have never once asked it a direct question. Here is the question. What if the hum isn't coming from your circumstances at all? What if it's coming from the gap between how you're living and how you're built to live? That gap doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up as a crisis, at least not at first. It shows up as small substitutions you barely register. You reach for your phone instead of finishing a thought. You say yes to a request out of speed, not conviction, because saying no would require a pause you don't feel you can afford. You plan the next 3 things before you've finished the one in front of you. None of these moments feels like a decision. Each one feels like the only reasonable response to a day that's already moving too fast to interrupt. This is the first thing worth naming clearly. The disorder that runs through most adult lives doesn't arrive as an event. It arrives as an accumulation of reasonable-seeming adjustments, made one at a time, none of them looking dangerous on their own. You didn't choose to live at this pitch. You adapted into it, the same way a person adapts to a room that's slowly losing oxygen. By the time you notice you're breathing differently, you've already forgotten what the other kind of air felt like. Trine, writing more than a century ago, gave this gap a specific name. He called it living out of tune with the infinite, a phrase that sounds, on first hearing, like something for people who already meditate on mountaintops. But strip away the language of his era and the claim underneath is almost uncomfortably practical. He's describing a person who has stopped listening to the deeper current that runs beneath ordinary awareness, and who has replaced that listening with noise. Worry standing in for planning, urgency standing in for purpose, exhaustion standing in for effort. Notice the distinction hiding inside that last sentence. Worry and planning look similar from the outside. Both involve thinking ahead. But planning ends when the plan is made. Worry doesn't end. It just repeats, offering nothing new on the 40th pass that it didn't offer on the first. If you've ever caught yourself rehearsing the same fear at 2 a.m. for the 3rd night running, you already know which one you were doing. Here's where the gentler, harder truth comes in. None of this means something is broken in you. It means something in you has been trying to get your attention for a long time. using the only language available to it once you stopped listening on purpose. Physical restlessness, low-grade dread, the sense that you're always slightly behind. That's not weakness. That's a signal, and signals exist because something on the other end is still transmitting. Picture the version of you that existed before any of this static built up. Not a childhood memory exactly, more like a texture, a kind of steadiness that used to be available before the adjustments started stacking.
You didn't lose access to it because it stopped existing. You lost access to it because you stopped checking. This is the part that tends to get skipped in most conversations about stress and burnout. The usual advice treats the noise as the problem to be managed. Sleep more. Set better boundaries. Take a walk. All useful, none of it wrong. But it treats the hum as an enemy to be quieted rather than a message to be read. It's the difference between muting a smoke alarm and finding the source of the smoke. There's a specific moment worth sitting with, the kind that happens to almost everyone at some point, and gets explained away almost immediately afterward. You're driving somewhere familiar, and you arrive without remembering most of the drive. For those minutes, your body ran the whole operation without your conscious mind supervising a single turn. That's unsettling the first time you notice it, and then it becomes evidence of something important. There is a part of you operating with more competence, more calm, and more continuity than the part you've been putting in charge of everything else. It's not a metaphor. It's closer to a fact you've been driving past for years. The chapters ahead are going to sit with that fact and ask what it would mean to actually trust it, not as a slogan, but as a working theory about how a life could run. Not the fixed version, not the productivity-hacked version. The tuned version. The one where the hum goes quiet not because you've silenced it, but because you've finally answered it. For now, just notice the static. Don't fix it yet. Don't explain it away as busyness or age or a bad week. Just notice that it's been there for longer than you've been willing to admit, and that noticing it, really noticing it without flinching, is the first thing that's happened in this whole process that wasn't a reaction. There's a distinction worth drawing here, because the two get treated as the same thing, and they aren't. Tiredness and depletion are not the same condition, even though they feel similar from the inside. Tiredness has a known cause and a known cure. You stayed up too late, you worked too hard, and a full night of sleep mostly settles the account. Depletion doesn't respond to sleep the same way, because it isn't coming from the hours you kept. It's coming from the static itself, from the low continuous cost of running a second, unacknowledged process underneath every ordinary task. You can sleep 9 hours and wake up already behind, and if you've ever had that exact experience, some part of you already knows that whatever's draining you isn't on the same clock as your bedtime. Consider what happens when the hum goes unanswered for long enough. It doesn't stay a private, contained discomfort. It starts to leak into decisions that have nothing to do with sleep or stress on the surface. The invitation you decline because you can't picture having the energy for it, though the event itself would take less out of you than an evening scrolling alone. The project you don't start because starting anything new right now feels like more than you can carry, even though the actual first step would take 20 minutes. None of these choices look connected to each other. Each one gets its own private explanation. But underneath all of them is the same unanswered hum, quietly narrowing the size of a life one plausible-sounding no at a time. That cup of coffee from Sunday afternoon is still sitting there, half-finished, going cold. And the only question worth asking is whether you're finally ready to sit down long enough to drink it. Chapter 2. The Reasons You Believe Yourself. Denial rarely feels like denial. It feels like a good explanation. Nobody wakes up one day and decides to stop seeing what's obviously true about their life. That's not how it works. Instead, you build a small case, one piece of evidence at a time, for why the hum from yesterday doesn't actually mean anything. You tell yourself it's just a busy season. You tell yourself everyone feels this way in their 30s or 40s or wherever you happen to be standing. You tell yourself the exhaustion will lift once the project ends, once the kids start sleeping through the night, once the promotion finally comes through. Each explanation, taken alone, sounds completely reasonable. That's exactly the problem. This is functional denial, and it deserves a more careful look than the word denial usually gets. Most people picture denial as something dramatic, a person insisting a house isn't on fire while standing in the smoke. Real denial is quieter than that. It doesn't deny facts. It reframes them. You're not avoiding the truth that you're depleted. You're simply filing it under a category that requires nothing from you. Temporary circumstance rather than pattern. Here's the distinction worth sitting with. A circumstance is something that happens to you once and then resolves. A pattern is something that keeps happening because of how you're built to respond. The difference matters because circumstances get waited out, while patterns get repeated. If you've told yourself things will calm down after this more than twice in the last 2 years, about different things each time, you're not describing a circumstance anymore. You're describing your operating system and calling it weather. Trine wrote about this without using modern language for it. But the observation holds up. He described people who sense, faintly, that something in their approach to life is misaligned, and who respond to that sense not by investigating it, but by working harder within the same misalignment. More hours, more discipline, more willpower thrown at a problem that was never a willpower problem to begin with. It's the equivalent of pressing the accelerator harder in a car that's stuck in the mud. The effort feels like progress. The wheels are just digging the hole deeper. Why would anyone do this? Not from laziness and not from stupidity. The honest answer is that changing course requires admitting the previous course was wrong. And that admission costs something real. It costs identity. If you've spent a decade telling yourself you're the reliable one, the one who pushes through, then noticing that pushing through isn't working anymore means questioning a story you've built your whole self-image around. That's not a small ask. That's why the mind will produce almost any alternative explanation before it produces that one. Consider the version of this that shows up in relationships. You notice somewhere in the back of your awareness that a particular conversation always leaves you smaller than it found you. You could name that directly. Instead, you find a reason it doesn't count this time. They were stressed. You were oversensitive. It's not the pattern, it's the Tuesday. The explanation isn't a lie exactly. It's a small, sincere effort to avoid a bigger and more uncomfortable truth, which is that the pattern has a shape, and the shape has been repeating for longer than either of you wants to admit. Here's a question worth sitting with honestly, without rushing to answer it. What would you have to admit was true if you stopped explaining away the thing you already suspect? There's a specific mechanism at work here, one that psychologists have a name for, and that Trine intuited without the vocabulary. The mind treats consistency as safety. Once you've told yourself a story about who you are and how your life works, contradicting that story registers, at some level, as a threat. Not a logical threat, a structural one. So the mind does what any system under threat does. It defends. It generates reasons. It reframes contradictory evidence until the evidence fits the existing story instead of the other way around. This isn't a character flaw, it's a feature of how minds hold themselves together. But features can still cause damage when they run unexamined for years. Think about the difference between a symptom and a cause. A headache is a symptom. Dehydration might be the cause. If you only ever treat the headache, you never run out of headaches because you never touch the thing producing them. Most of the explanations you've been offering yourself, the busy season, the difficult year, the phase you're going through, are attempts to treat the headache while insisting the water bottle is fine. And the water bottle has been empty for a while now. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes specifically from maintaining a story you no longer fully believe. It's different from the exhaustion of hard work. Hard work tires the body and leaves the mind relatively clear. Maintaining a story you're not sure is true anymore tires something closer to the center of you, because part of your attention is always on guard duty, watching for the moments when the story might slip. That's a second job, running underneath the first one, and it never clocks out. So here's the harder question, the one this chapter has been circling without landing on directly. Not what's wrong with your circumstances, but what have you been calling a circumstance that is actually a pattern? Not why is this such a hard season, but how many seasons in a row have felt exactly like this? You don't have to answer that fully right now. Denial doesn't dissolve because someone points at it. It dissolves slowly, the way frost comes off a window, 1 degree at a time, until you can suddenly see through to what was there all along. But something has already shifted just by naming the mechanism instead of living inside it unnamed. You can't unsee a pattern once you've called it a pattern instead of a circumstance. There's a useful distinction between a convenient explanation and an honest one, and most functional denial lives entirely inside the first category without ever being tested against the second. A convenient explanation asks one question: does this let me avoid changing anything today? An honest explanation asks a harder one: is this actually the most accurate account of what's happening, whether or not I like where it leads? The two can produce identical sounding sentences. It's just a busy season could be either. The only way to tell them apart is to notice which one keeps needing to be repeated. Honest explanations tend to resolve something and then go quiet. Convenient explanations have to be reissued every few weeks, in slightly different language because the thing they were covering for never actually went anywhere. Here's a small test worth applying to any explanation you've been leaning on. Ask what would have to be true for the explanation to stop working, and then check whether that condition has already been met without you noticing. If busy season was the honest cause, the season eventually ends, and so does the exhaustion. If the exhaustion persists through a slow month, a vacation, a stretch with nothing due, the explanation has already failed its own test quietly, some time ago. And what's kept it standing since then isn't evidence. It's the fact that nobody ever went back and checked. The water bottle has been empty for longer than you've admitted. And the next chapter isn't going to fill it for you. It's going to show you exactly how you learned to walk past it without noticing it was dry. Chapter 3. The pattern finally gets a name. You've felt this for years. You just never had the word for it. There's a specific kind of relief that comes from hearing someone describe your exact experience without ever having met you. Not comfort exactly, recognition. The feeling of a lock turning quiet and precise, somewhere you didn't know was locked. That's what happens the moment a vague, years-long discomfort finally gets a name. And the name for what's been running underneath the last 2 chapters is simple enough to say in one sentence. You have been living from the outside in, treating your circumstances as the cause of your state, when the current has always run the other way. Say that slowly, because it sounds almost too plain to matter. Outside in means believing your mood follows your inbox. It means believing your sense of possibility depends on the number in your bank account, or the tone of a text message, or whether the meeting went well. Most people live this way without ever choosing it, because it's the default operating assumption of a world built on immediate feedback. Something happens, you react. The reaction feels like the truth of who you are that day. Nobody hands you the alternative. You just absorb outside in living the way you absorb a language, before you're old enough to know a different grammar exists. Inside out is the reversal, and it's not a slogan. It's a mechanical claim about which direction causation actually runs. Your state generates your circumstances far more often than your circumstances generate your state. Not always, not in a way that erases real hardship, but far more often than the outside-in story admits. 2 people can receive the identical piece of bad news on the identical morning, and one spends the day rebuilding, while the other spends the week collapsed. The news was the same. The difference was already present before the news arrived. Trine's version of this claim was stated in the spiritual language of his century, but the underlying observation translates without much friction. He argued that a person's connection to what he called the infinite, the deeper current running beneath ordinary awareness, determines far more about their experience than the specific events that occur to them. Swap the infinite for something more familiar. Call it your baseline state. Call it the tone you're carrying into a day before the day has done anything to you. Whatever you call it, the claim is the same. It sets the terms under which everything else gets interpreted. Here's where the pattern gets sharper edges. Notice the difference between reacting and responding. Reacting happens before thought has a chance to intervene. Something occurs, and the body answers on its own, the way a hand pulls back from a hot surface before the mind registers pain. Responding happens after a pause, however brief, where a person actually gets to choose the shape of what comes next. Most days, for most people, almost everything is reaction. The inbox opens and the jaw tightens before a single email has been read. The response was decided before the input arrived, which means it was never really a response to that input at all. It was a rehearsal of an old pattern, wearing today's circumstances as a costume. This is the mechanism worth naming precisely, because once it's named, you start seeing it everywhere. You are not responding to your actual life most of the time. You are responding to a pattern that formed years ago, one that gets triggered by anything shaped roughly like its original cause, and that pattern is running the show while you experience it as a fresh reaction to a fresh event. Here's a question that deserves an honest answer, even if it takes a while to arrive. What did your life look like the last time you responded to something instead of reacting to it? Can you find that moment? What was different about it? Consider two people standing at the exact same door, waiting on the exact same piece of news. One has spent the morning already braced, jaw tight, breath shallow, mentally rehearsing 3 different disaster scenarios before anyone has said a word. The other has spent the morning steady, not because nothing is at stake, but because their steadiness isn't built on the outcome. When the door opens and the news turns out to be bad for both of them, something different happens. The first person collapses because the news confirmed a story they'd already been living inside for hours. The second person grieves, cleanly, and starts moving. Same news, different architecture underneath it. That architecture is the thing this chapter is naming. It would be easy to hear all of this as another version of just think positive, and that would be a serious misreading. Positive thinking, as it's commonly sold, asks you to paint over the static from Chapter 1 with cheerful language. What's being named here is the opposite of painting over anything. It's the recognition that the static itself is not neutral information about your circumstances. It's information about your baseline, and your baseline is not fixed. It's not identity. It's a setting, and settings can be adjusted by someone who finally understands which dial they're touching. This is also where the distinction between habit and identity starts to matter. A habit is something you do. Living outside in has become for most people closer to an identity, a settled belief about how a person's life is supposed to work, absorbed so early and so thoroughly that it no longer feels like a belief at all. It feels like reality. That's exactly what makes it powerful, and exactly what makes it worth questioning. Beliefs that feel like reality are the ones running your life without your permission. None of this means circumstances don't matter. A layoff is still a layoff. A diagnosis is still a diagnosis. The claim isn't that outer events are illusions. The claim is narrower and more useful than that. Your baseline state determines how much room those events have to move you. And for most people, that baseline has never once been examined on purpose. It was set early, by circumstances long past, and it has been running unattended ever since, like a thermostat nobody has touched in 15 years, quietly deciding the temperature of every room you walk into. You now have a name for what chapters 1 and 2 were circling. Not stress, not a busy season.
Not a personal failing, a direction of causation, running backward from how you assumed it ran, and a baseline setting installed so long ago you mistook it for the truth of who you are. The next question isn't whether this is true. Some part of you already knows it is, or this chapter wouldn't have landed the way it did. The next question is how that setting got installed in the first place, and why it's been so difficult to touch, given that naming it clearly, as this chapter just did, still hasn't been enough on its own to move it. Naming was necessary. It was never going to be sufficient by itself. And the next chapter is where that distinction finally gets explained. That's where the next chapter goes, all the way down to the mechanism itself, without flinching from what it finds there. Chapter 4. The Anatomy of the Setting. This is how it works from the inside. No judgment. Just the machinery. Take the thermostat from the last chapter seriously for a moment, because it's not just a metaphor, it's close to a literal description of how a nervous system learns to run. A thermostat doesn't choose its setting through argument or willpower. It gets calibrated once, usually early, usually by someone else's hand, and then it holds that setting until something forces a recalibration. Most people's baseline state got installed the same way, sometime before they had the language to question it, and it has been quietly running the temperature of every room they've walked into since. Here's the anatomy, piece by piece, without blame anywhere in it. Start with the body, because the body is where this actually happens first, before a single thought forms. A child raised in an unpredictable household, where a parent's mood could shift without warning, learns something the body never forgets. Stay alert. Read the room before speaking. Keep a portion of attention on guard at all times. That's not a decision. It's an adaptation. And it's a good one, given the environment that produced it. The problem isn't that the adaptation happened. The problem is that adaptations don't come with expiration dates. The environment changes. The wiring stays. 20 years later, that same person sits in a meeting where nothing is actually wrong, and a portion of their attention is still on guard, still scanning tone of voice for signs of danger that isn't there anymore. They call this being perceptive. Sometimes it's just an old setting, running in a room it was never built for. This is the first honest thing to say about the mechanism. It was never irrational. Every baseline setting made sense given the conditions that produced it. The person who learned to overfunction to earn approval was responding accurately to a household where approval was scarce and conditional. The person who learned to disappear during conflict was responding accurately to a household where visibility during conflict was dangerous. Naming the setting is not an indictment of the person who built it. It's closer to an engineer's respect for how well the original solution worked, combined with an honest look at whether it's still solving the right problem. Distinguish this from blame, because that distinction matters more than almost anything else in this chapter. Understanding where a pattern came from is not the same as excusing it or being stuck with it. It's the opposite. You cannot recalibrate a setting you refuse to locate. Trine described something adjacent to this when he wrote about the accumulated weight of old thought habits, patterns of mind repeated so many times they stopped feeling like patterns and started feeling like personality. He didn't have access to modern language about nervous systems and early attachment, but he was pointing at the same structure, a groove worn into a surface by repetition, deep enough that new water simply runs along the old path, whether or not that path leads anywhere useful anymore. Here's where the mechanism gets more specific, because old pattern is still too vague to be useful. What actually happens mechanically is this. The body encounters something in the present that shares even a loose resemblance to the original danger, and the nervous system responds to the resemblance, not to the actual present-day stakes. A raised voice in a meeting doesn't objectively threaten anyone's safety, but if a raised voice was once genuinely dangerous, the body doesn't run a full risk assessment before reacting. It matches pattern to pattern, fires the old response, and only afterward does the thinking mind arrive
to explain why the reaction made sense. This is backward from how most people believe they operate. Most people believe they think, then feel, then act. The actual sequence most of the time is closer to: the body reacts, then the feeling arrives, then the mind builds a story to justify what already happened. This explains something that otherwise looks like a contradiction. Why would a capable, intelligent person keep making a choice they can clearly see isn't working? Because the choice isn't being made by the part of them doing the seeing. The seeing happens in the thinking mind, arriving late, evaluating a decision that the older, faster system already made and started executing. By the time insight shows up, the car is already moving. This is why insight alone so rarely changes behavior. You can understand a pattern completely and still watch yourself repeat it next Tuesday, because understanding lives in a different location than the mechanism doing the driving. Consider the specific shape this takes in daily life. Someone learned early that needs were a burden to other people. Not through one dramatic event necessarily. Sometimes through 1,000 small, unremarkable moments where a parent sighed at the wrong time, or answered a request with visible fatigue. No single moment did the damage. The accumulation did. That person is now 38 years old, financially independent, respected at work, and still finds it almost physically difficult to ask a colleague for help on a project, not because they've reasoned their way to that conclusion, but because some old wordless calculation is still running. Needing things costs you standing with people. Nobody taught them that sentence. Their body assembled it from evidence, years before language could have argued with it. This is the moment worth sitting with the distinction between two ideas that get treated as synonyms and aren't: fault and origin. Fault asks who's to blame. Origin asks where something started. You can trace the exact origin of a pattern with total clarity and assign zero fault to anyone involved, including yourself, including whoever's household produced the original conditions. The tracing isn't about blame. It's about location. You cannot recalibrate a setting whose location you refuse to look at directly. The same way you cannot fix a thermostat by staring at the room temperature instead of the dial. Here's the part that tends to get missed in most conversations about this. The mechanism isn't malfunctioning. That's the uncomfortable, freeing truth underneath all of it. It's functioning exactly as designed, executing a solution to a problem that may no longer exist. A smoke detector that goes off every time you make toast isn't broken. It's doing its one job with total fidelity, in an environment that no longer matches the danger it was built to detect. The instinct is to rip the batteries out. The better move, harder but more accurate, is to recalibrate the sensor to the room it's actually in now. That recalibration is not fast, and it is not a single decision made once at a kitchen table. It happens the way the original setting was installed, through repetition, except this time the repetition is chosen instead of absorbed. But recalibration can't begin until the setting has been located, named, and separated cleanly from blame. That's what this chapter has been doing. Not fixing anything yet, just opening the panel and looking without flinching at the wiring that's actually there. The next chapter goes somewhere harder, not what the pattern cost you emotionally, which is where most people stop looking. What it has actually cost, in years, in relationships, in rooms you never walked into, because some old wiring decided for you that you shouldn't. That number has never been calculated honestly. It's about to be. Chapter 5. The Cost. Nobody calculates until it's too late. Not the big losses. The smaller ones, 1,000 ordinary Tuesdays, quietly withdrawn. There's a kind of math almost nobody runs on purpose, and it's the only math that actually matters here. Not the cost of a divorce or a diagnosis or a lost job. Those get counted because they announce themselves, because they arrive with paperwork and a date attached. The cost this chapter is interested in is quieter than that. It's the cost of a setting left uncalibrated for 20 years, charged in installments so small
that no single one seemed worth stopping to examine. Start with something specific instead of something abstract, because the abstract version of this always sounds survivable. A woman spends 14 years in a job that stopped fitting her around year 6. She knows this. She's known it for a long time. In the way people know things they've decided not to look at directly. Every year, the gap between who she's become and what the job asks of her widens by some small amount. And every year, the cost of leaving looks slightly larger than the cost of staying. Because staying is a known quantity and leaving is not. That calculation is not irrational. It's exactly how the old setting from Chapter 4 is built to think. But run the math forward honestly, and something else becomes visible. She hasn't spent 14 years staying in one job. She spent 14 years not becoming 8 different versions of herself that might have existed on the other side of a decision she kept deferring. That's the actual currency being spent here. And it's worth naming precisely because it never shows up on a balance sheet. Not money, not time exactly, but unlived versions of a life. Every year the old setting stays in charge instead of getting recalibrated is a year that gets spent servicing a pattern instead of building something new on top of it. The debt doesn't announce itself with an interest rate. It just quietly compounds, the way any debt does when nobody's checking the statement. Here's a question worth sitting with longer than feels comfortable. What is the honest, unflattering list of decisions you've made in the last 5 years? Once you remove every explanation you've given yourself for making them, not the story. The decisions themselves, stripped bare. Trine wrote about this cost using the language of wasted force, describing a person whose energy gets spent fighting an internal misalignment instead of moving forward with it. He didn't have a modern vocabulary for chronic stress or decision fatigue, but the observation holds up under translation. A person operating from an uncalibrated baseline is not simply less happy. They are running 2 operations simultaneously at all times, the actual task in front of them, and a background process managing the static, the vigilance, the old wiring that never got updated. That second process consumes real resources. It's the reason a person can sleep 8 hours and still wake up tired. The exhaustion was never really about the hours. It was about running 2 systems on one battery for years, without ever checking why the battery kept draining faster than it should. Consider the relational version of this cost, because it tends to be the most expensive and the least discussed. A man learned early that expressing a genuine need made him a burden. He didn't decide this consciously. It assembled itself out of small evidence over years, the way the previous chapter described. Now he's 41, in a marriage that looks stable from the outside, and his wife has spent a decade slowly starving for a version of intimacy he has never once offered her, because offering it would require naming a need out loud. And naming a need out loud still registers, somewhere old and wordless in him, as danger. Nobody's cheating. Nobody's yelling. The marriage simply runs at a lower temperature than either of them wanted, year after year, and the cost of that lower temperature never gets an invoice. It just gets absorbed on both sides, as the ordinary cost of being married to a person, rather than recognized as the specific and addressable cost of one uncalibrated setting neither of them ever named. This is the distinction worth holding carefully here. Disappointment versus grief. Disappointment is what you feel about a single event that didn't go the way you wanted. Grief is what you feel about an accumulation once you finally see its total size. Most people live inside years of small disappointments without ever running the math that would turn those disappointments into a single, honest grief. That refusal to add it up isn't a failure of feeling. It's a form of self-protection. Because the total, once seen clearly, is heavier than any single installment ever was. But protection that prevents you from ever seeing the real number is also protection that guarantees the number keeps growing. There's a particular trap embedded in how this cost gets rationalized, and it deserves to be named plainly. The old setting insists quietly and constantly that the cost of staying the same is 0,
or close to it, because staying the same feels safe and familiar. It is not zero. It has simply been billed in a currency that doesn't show up on any statement you've been trained to read. The friend you didn't call because reaching out felt like too much exposure. The promotion you didn't ask for because asking felt like overreach. The sentence you didn't finish in an argument because finishing it felt like too much risk. None of these, alone, look like anything. Stacked across a decade, they are the shape of an entire unlived alternative. This is not a chapter about guilt. And if guilt is what's arriving right now, it's worth setting down before it takes over. Guilt asks what's wrong with you. This chapter is asking something different. What has this pattern actually cost, in plain terms? And are you willing to look at the number honestly enough to finally stop paying it? Here's what makes this cost so difficult to see in real time. Every individual payment is small enough to absorb without noticing. A conversation not had. A boundary not set. A risk not taken. Each one, on its own Tuesday, looks like nothing, looks like caution, looks even like wisdom. It's only in retrospect, from a distance of years, that the pattern of small non-decisions reveals itself as the actual architecture of a life, built not on purpose, but by default, one deferred moment at a time. The honest question this chapter leaves you with is not comfortable, and it isn't supposed to be. If nothing changes in how the old setting runs, what does the next decade look like, specifically, in the same currency as everything named here? Not disaster, just more of the same small withdrawals, quietly compounding, until another 5 years have been spent servicing a debt nobody ever agreed to, and nobody ever calculated. That number is real. It has been accumulating this entire time, whether or not it's been counted. The next chapter is not going to add more weight to it. It's going to explain, honestly and without blame, why every previous attempt to stop the bleeding didn't work, and what that failure was actually telling you all along. Chapter 6. Why the previous attempts never held. It wasn't a lack of effort. It was the wrong kind of effort applied with real conviction. You have tried before. This chapter starts there because it's true, and because most explanations for stalled change skip straight past it, implying that if you'd just tried harder or tried differently, or found the right book at the right time, the pattern would have broken by now. That framing is not just unkind, it's inaccurate. You have, in fact, tried. The gym membership was real. The 3 months of therapy were real. The morning routine you kept for 6 weeks before it quietly dissolved was real. None of that effort was wasted in the way you've probably decided it was. It failed for a specific, nameable reason. And the reason has nothing to do with how hard you pushed. Here's the reason, stated plainly before it gets unpacked. Every previous attempt tried to change behavior at the level of behavior, while the setting from Chapter 4 kept operating untouched one level below. You cannot outrun a thermostat by changing your clothes. You can layer up, strip down, adjust every visible thing about how you're dressed for the room, and the room stays exactly as cold as the dial says it should be, because the dial was never part of what you touched. This is the distinction the last 5 chapters have been building toward, and it finally has a direct application. Willpower operates on behavior. It says, do this thing, don't do that thing, hold the line through discomfort. Willpower is real, and it works, for exactly as long as the baseline setting isn't actively working against it. But willpower spends a finite resource, and the old setting doesn't get tired. It runs in the background at zero cost to itself, waiting. Most change attempts are a contest between a resource that depletes and a pattern that doesn't, and anyone could have predicted the outcome of that contest in advance, if anyone had ever framed it that clearly. Notice the distinction quietly buried in that last paragraph, because it changes everything downstream of it. Discipline versus fidelity. Discipline is willpower applied to a behavior you don't yet believe in at the deepest level. It's motion generated by force, and force runs out. Fidelity is different. Fidelity is what happens after the setting itself has shifted, when the behavior stops requiring force because it's now aligned with what you actually are. Every failed attempt you've made was discipline, applied honestly and with real effort, to a setting that fidelity had never touched. Consider the specific shape this takes with something as ordinary as a morning routine. You decide, with total sincerity, to wake early and spend 20 minutes in silence before the day starts. For the first 10 days, this works, because the decision itself carries momentum. By day 11, the old setting reasserts itself, quietly, in the form of a thought that doesn't announce itself as sabotage. Just this once, sleep matters more today. That thought isn't a moral failure. It's the thermostat, doing exactly what thermostats do, pulling the temperature of your behavior back toward its actual setting the moment the initial burst of willpower runs low. You didn't fail the routine. The routine was never running against the right target. This is why so many people describe change as a cycle of intense starts followed by quiet collapses, and then blame the collapse on some flaw in their character, some persistent lack of discipline they've decided defines them. That conclusion, arrived at honestly but based on incomplete information, is one of the most expensive misdiagnoses a person can make about themselves. It converts a structural problem, the setting operating below the behavior, into an identity problem. I am someone who can't follow through. The second story is far more damaging than the first, and it's also, most of the time, simply untrue. Here's a question worth answering honestly before moving forward. Think of the last attempt at change that collapsed. Not why it collapsed in general terms, but the specific moment, the specific thought that preceded the collapse. Was it a failure of effort? Or was it the old setting reasserting a temperature it had never actually agreed to change? There's a second, quieter reason previous attempts failed, and it deserves its own honest look. Some part of the old setting is, in a strange way, protective. It formed originally to keep you safe, back when the environment that produced it was genuinely dangerous. Recalibrating it doesn't just require effort. It requires convincing a system built entirely around vigilance that vigilance is no longer the only available option. And systems built around safety do not release their grip easily, even when the danger they were guarding against has been gone for 20 years. This isn't resistance in the sense of laziness or lack of commitment. It's closer to loyalty, a very old and very literal form of loyalty, to a version of you that once needed exactly this protection to survive. That reframe matters more than it might seem to at first. If the previous failures were about weak willpower, the only available response is more willpower, applied again, harder, until it burns out again. But if the previous failures were about trying to out-discipline a loyal, protective system operating one level below discipline's reach, the available response changes entirely. You stop asking how to push harder against the setting. You start asking what it would take to actually update it, the way you'd update any system built on outdated information, not by force, but by giving it new, repeated evidence that the old danger is no longer present. This is not a small shift in framing. It's the difference between a decade of increasingly exhausted attempts and an approach that finally has a chance of holding, because it's aimed at the actual mechanism instead of its surface behavior. The gym memberships weren't failures of character. The unfinished routines weren't proof of some permanent flaw. They were attempts made at the wrong altitude, sincere efforts spent trying to outmuscle a dial that force was never going to move. There's one more distinction worth making before moving on, because it changes how the next attempt gets built. Motivation and evidence are not the same fuel, even though they get used interchangeably. Motivation is a feeling about the future, a sense that this time will be different, and it burns hot and fast, which is exactly why so many change efforts peak in the first week and fade by the third. Evidence is different. Evidence is a fact about the past, something that already happened and can't be argued away by a bad night's sleep. A plan built entirely on motivation is a plan built on the least reliable resource available. A plan built on accumulating evidence, small proof after small proof that the new response actually works, is building on something that doesn't evaporate the moment enthusiasm does. You were never lazy. You were never weak. You were fighting a system built to protect you, using the only tool anyone ever handed you, which was never built for this particular job. The next chapter is where the real tool gets introduced, small enough to actually work, and aimed finally at the setting itself instead of its shadow. Chapter 7. The Fragment That Still Works. Not a plan, not a program, something smaller and already proven. Somewhere in your life there is a moment that already worked. Not a theory about what might help, not an idea borrowed from a book you read once and never applied. An actual lived instance, however brief, where the old setting from Chapter 4 loosened its grip, and something steadier took over, and you moved through a piece of your life differently than the pattern would have predicted. This chapter isn't going to hand you a new system built from scratch. It's going to ask you to find that moment, examine it closely, and take it seriously as evidence, because you've probably been dismissing it as a fluke for years. Here's why that moment matters more than any new technique could. A new technique arrives from outside you, untested against your specific wiring, asking to be trusted on faith. The fragment this chapter is interested in has none of that problem, because it already happened. It's not a hypothesis. It's a data point, sitting quietly in your own history, that the old setting cannot argue with as easily as it argues with something borrowed from a stranger's book. Think concretely, because this only works if it stays specific. Maybe it was a single conversation once, where you said the difficult true thing instead of the easier managed thing, and the room didn't collapse the way the old setting insisted it would. Maybe it was a week early in a relationship now over, when you asked for exactly what you needed without apologizing for needing it, and it worked, and you've quietly filed that week away as an exception rather than as proof. Maybe it's smaller than either of those. Maybe it's a single morning once, when you sat with the discomfort of an unanswered email for 4 hours instead of checking your phone 40 times, and something in you stayed calm anyway, and you never asked yourself how. Here's the exercise this chapter is actually built around, and it deserves real time, not a quick pass. Name one specific moment, as concrete as you can make it, when you responded instead of reacted, in the sense Chapter 3 described. Not a general period of feeling good. One moment. What was different about you, specifically, in that moment, compared to how the old setting usually runs the same situation? Trine described something close to this when he wrote about moments of what he called conscious union, brief periods when a person's action lined up cleanly with their deeper current instead of fighting against it. He treated these moments as rare, almost accidental gifts. The more useful reframe, available now with everything the last 6 chapters have built, is that these moments weren't accidents at all. They were glimpses of what the recalibrated setting actually feels like from the inside, evidence smuggled through the noise, proof that the old wiring is not the only wiring available to you. This is where the distinction between insight and evidence becomes important, and it deserves to be held on to carefully, because the two are not the same thing, and get confused constantly. Insight is understanding a pattern intellectually, which Chapter 4 already gave you plenty of. Evidence is different. Evidence is a lived instance that contradicts the pattern's central claim, and evidence carries weight that insight alone never manages, because the old setting was built from lived instances too. It was assembled piece by piece out of 1,000 small moments of genuine danger long ago. It will not be dismantled by an argument. It will only be updated by new lived instances stacked carefully against the old ones, until the newer evidence outweighs the older evidence enough for the setting itself to shift.
This is why the fragment matters so specifically. It's not inspiration. It's the first entry in a new ledger, and ledgers only work if they keep getting entries. Consider what happens once you actually locate the fragment, and look at it honestly instead of writing it off as luck. Usually something becomes visible that felt invisible in the moment itself. Maybe the difficult conversation worked, not because the stakes were low, but because you happened to be tired enough that particular evening to skip the usual rehearsal the old setting insists on before you speak. Maybe the calm morning happened because you'd slept unusually well the night before, and the vigilance simply had less fuel to run on. These aren't disappointing explanations, they're clues. They tell you something real about the conditions under which the recalibrated version of you gets to show up, which means they tell you something about how to create those conditions again, on purpose, instead of waiting for them to arrive by accident. Notice the shape of what's happening here because it's easy to miss. You are not being asked to become someone new. You are being asked to notice that the someone new already showed up once, briefly, and to start asking what made that possible. There's a specific trap worth naming before it does its usual damage. The old setting, encountering this fragment, will offer an explanation designed to neutralize it. That was different. That doesn't count. You got lucky that one time. This is the same mechanism from Chapter 2. Functional denial, showing up again in a new disguise. It's not malicious. It's the setting protecting its own continuity. The same way any long-running system resists evidence that it might need to change. The honest response to that explanation isn't to argue with it. It's simply to notice it happening, name it as the old pattern defending itself, and hold on to the fragment anyway. This is the actual first movement, smaller than anyone expects, and more durable than any new system imposed from outside. Not a resolution to change everything starting Monday. Not a 12-step program borrowed from someone else's life. One real, specific, already proven instance, examined closely enough to understand what made it possible, held as evidence against a setting that has had the field to itself for far too long. There's a longer-term consequence worth naming here, because it explains why this particular exercise matters more than it looks like it should. A life built entirely on insight without evidence stays theoretical indefinitely. A collection of things you understand about yourself that never quite translate into a different Tuesday. A life that starts collecting real fragments, one proven instance at a time, begins to accumulate something insight alone never produces, a track record, and a track record, unlike a good idea, is the one kind of argument the old setting eventually has to reckon with, because it isn't asking to be believed. It already happened. The fragment is real. It happened. It is not the exception to your life. It may be the first honest glimpse of what your life is actually capable of running on, once the static gets quiet enough to hear it. Hold on to it deliberately, the way you'd hold on to the first real receipt in a case you're still building. The next chapter is where the resistance to repeating it shows up in full force, because evidence this threatening to an old pattern never goes unchallenged for long. Chapter 8. The resistance that shows up when you mean it. The moment you actually try, something in you pushes back. That's not a bad sign. It's confirmation you found the real thing. Something strange happens the first time you deliberately try to repeat the fragment from the last chapter instead of waiting for it to arrive by accident.
You'd expect it to feel encouraging, since you're finally acting on real evidence instead of guesswork. Instead, for most people it feels worse. A tightness shows up that wasn't there during the ordinary, unexamined version of the pattern. A voice gets louder, one that had been running quietly in the background for years, and it suddenly has opinions about exactly what you're attempting. This is the moment most change efforts get abandoned, and it's almost always misread. The tightness gets interpreted as a sign that the attempt is wrong, that you're forcing something unnatural, that the old way, whatever its costs, was at least familiar enough to be safe. That interpretation is understandable, and it is backward. The resistance showing up now, at exactly this moment, is not evidence you're on the wrong track. It's evidence you've finally touched the actual wiring, not just its shadow. Here's why this happens, mechanically, without any mystery attached to it. The old setting from Chapter 4 was built for a reason, and it has been running successfully, by its own definition of success, for a very long time. Successfully doesn't mean happily. It means the setting has reliably prevented the specific danger it was built to prevent, whatever that danger originally was: exposure, disappointment, abandonment, humiliation. When you deliberately act against that setting on purpose more than once, the system doesn't experience this as growth. It experiences it as a threat to its core function, because as far as it's concerned, its core function is keeping you safe, and you're now behaving in a way that looks, to a system with no sense of updated context, exactly like the beginning of danger. This is worth sitting with directly, because the language matters. Resistance is not the opposite of progress. It's the sound progress makes when it's real. A setting that felt nothing when you tried to change would be a setting that had nothing invested in staying the same. The fact that something in you is pushing back means something in you finally noticed you were serious. Trine wrote about a version of this without the modern vocabulary, describing the discomfort that arrives when a person begins to align with their deeper current after years of living against it. He treated it, somewhat optimistically, as a temporary friction that dissolves quickly once the alignment takes hold. The more honest version, available now with everything the previous chapters have built, is that the friction doesn't dissolve because the new direction becomes comfortable overnight. It dissolves because you keep going anyway, enough times, that the old setting slowly runs out of reasons to treat the new behavior as dangerous. Consider what this actually looks like in a specific lived moment. You've decided, based on the fragment you located last chapter, to say the true thing in a conversation instead of the managed thing. You open your mouth. Something in your chest tightens first, a full second before any words arrive, an old and very physical signal that used to mean real danger was close. Your first instinct is to soften what you were about to say, to retreat toward the familiar version, the one that costs you nothing today, and slightly more than that every day after. This is the exact moment the old chapters have been building toward. Not the conversation itself. This half-second, where the tightness arrives and a choice gets made about whether to trust it or move through it. Notice the distinction this moment requires you to hold clearly. Fear as information versus fear as instruction. Fear as information tells you something real is at stake, that the moment matters, that you're not sleepwalking through it. Fear as instruction tells you to stop, retreat, revert to the old pattern immediately. Most people were never taught the difference, so they treat every fear signal as an instruction, which means the old setting gets to veto any attempt at change simply by producing its usual physical signature. Learning to receive the same signal as information instead, useful, worth noting, not in order to be obeyed, is one of the most important shifts available to a person trying to recalibrate anything real. Ask this honestly, because the answer tends to be more specific than expected. The last time you felt this exact tightness and retreated, what would have happened concretely if you'd stayed one sentence longer than the fear wanted you to stay? There's a particular danger in this chapter worth naming before it causes damage. The instinct, once resistance shows up, is to treat its intensity as a signal to slow down or stop entirely. Sometimes that's correct. Genuine danger still exists in the world, and this chapter isn't asking you to override every signal your body sends you. But there's a difference between genuine present danger and an old alarm firing at a threat that expired years ago, and the only way to tell them apart is to check honestly whether the danger being signaled actually exists in the room right now, or only exists in the room the setting was originally built for. This is where persistence starts to matter in a very specific, narrow sense. Not persistence as gritting your teeth through general hardship. Persistence as continuing to act on the new evidence, specifically at the moments when the old resistance is loudest, because those are precisely the moments the old setting is testing whether the new behavior is a fluke or a pattern. Give in every time the resistance spikes, and you confirm to the old system that the new behavior was never serious. Stay, even once, past the point where retreat felt easier, and you make a deposit in the ledger from the last chapter that the old setting cannot simply explain away. None of this is comfortable, and it isn't supposed to be. The tightness in your chest right now, if you're actually applying any of this instead of just reading about it, is not a malfunction. It's the most honest signal you've gotten in this entire process so far, because it's the first one that's actually costing you something to sit with. The old setting protected you once, and some part of it is still trying to protect you now, using the only method it has ever known. Think of it the way a muscle responds to a new demand it hasn't handled before. Soreness after that first real effort isn't a sign the movement was wrong. It's the expected, almost necessary evidence that something got worked that had been sitting idle. Nobody looks at that soreness and decides the body is broken. They recognize it as the cost of adaptation, and they keep moving carefully until the same motion stops being sore at all. The tightness in your chest during a hard conversation is asking for exactly that same patience, not avoidance. You don't need to silence that voice. You need to stop mistaking its volume for its accuracy. The next chapter takes this same resistance and asks what happens when you have to hold it not for one difficult conversation, but for weeks, on a day when nothing is going right and every reason to quit looks reasonable. Chapter 9. The version of you that shows up on the bad days. Anyone can hold a new pattern when the conditions are favorable. The real test arrives on a Tuesday when nothing is going right. There's a specific kind of morning that reveals whether anything from the last 8 chapters has actually taken hold, or whether it was only ever a good idea that worked under good conditions. You didn't sleep well. Something went wrong before you even sat down to your first task. A message arrived that stirred the exact old wiring from Chapter 4. And it arrived at the exact moment you had the least capacity to meet it differently. This is not a special or unusual day. This is most days eventually for everyone. And it's the day the old setting has been quietly waiting for, since Chapter 7 gave you your first piece of real evidence against it. Here's what tends to happen, and it deserves to be named without shame, because almost everyone experiences some version of it. On the good days, the recalibrated response feels almost natural. You catch the old pattern early. You hold the new evidence in mind. You make the choice that Chapter 8 asked you to practice. But on a low-energy day, the same moment arrives and something different happens. The old pattern doesn't ask permission. It simply runs, faster than the new evidence can get a word in. And by the time you notice what happened, you're already 3 sentences into the old script, the one built entirely for self-protection, the one that costs you the exact thing Chapter 5 calculated. This is the moment worth understanding clearly, because misunderstanding it is what causes most people to conclude that nothing has actually changed. Willpower, the resource named back in Chapter 6, is not a fixed quantity available equally every day. It runs on the same biological systems as everything else, and it depletes under exactly the conditions that make a bad day a bad day: poor sleep, low blood sugar, emotional depletion from an earlier interaction, physical illness. The old setting, meanwhile, doesn't run on willpower at all. It runs on habit, which requires almost no energy to execute because it was built originally to function, even when energy was scarce. That was the entire point of a survival pattern. It had to work especially well on the days when everything else was failing. This produces an uncomfortable but important asymmetry. The new recalibrated response requires energy to access, at least in its early stages, before repetition has made it automatic. The old response requires almost none. On a low-energy day, you are asking a resource-hungry new pattern to outcompete a resource-free old one, using a battery that's already running low from everything else the day has taken from you. Losing that particular contest is not evidence of failure. It's closer to a mathematical inevitability, given how the two systems are actually built. This distinction matters enough to state plainly. A bad day where the old pattern wins is not proof the recalibration failed. It's proof the recalibration is still early enough in its development that it hasn't yet become as energy efficient as the pattern it's replacing. That efficiency only comes with repetition, and repetition takes time that no single bad day can rush. Trine wrote about maintaining conscious contact with the deeper currents specifically during difficult periods, arguing that the connection matters most exactly when circumstances make it hardest to feel. He was right about the timing, even if his language obscured the actual mechanism. The days that test a recalibration hardest are also the days that matter most for whether it holds, not because effort on those days is nobler, but because those are the days the old setting is counting on you to prove it was right to doubt you. Consider what this looks like in practice, in a moment specific enough to be useful. You're exhausted. Something difficult has already happened earlier in the day. And now a second difficult moment arrives, one that would normally trigger the old pattern cleanly. You notice the old response start to move. The same tightness from Chapter 8, except this time there's almost nothing left in the tank to meet it with. Here is where a much smaller, much more realistic goal becomes valuable. Not a full recalibrated response, which may genuinely be out of reach today. Something smaller, a half-second pause before the old script runs. Not stopping the pattern, just interrupting its automaticity for a fraction of a second, enough to notice it happening instead of disappearing inside it completely. That half-second is not a failure dressed up as a small win. It's the actual unit of progress on a day like this. And expecting more than that from a body running on empty is not high standards. It's a misunderstanding of how the system works. The old setting would like you to believe that anything less than a full, clean, recalibrated response means the whole effort has failed. That belief is not accurate. It's the setting's oldest trick on all-or-nothing thinking, deployed specifically on the days it has the best odds of winning. Ask this honestly on a day like the one just described. What would it look like to aim for the half-second pause instead of the full response? And to count that pause as a real valid entry in the ledger from Chapter 7, rather than as a smaller version of failure? There's a relational dimension to this worth naming before moving forward, because bad days rarely happen in isolation from other people. On a depleted day, the old pattern doesn't just run internally. It runs in front of someone, in a tone of voice, in a withdrawal, in a decision to cancel a plan for reasons that sound practical, but are actually the old setting protecting itself. This is not a moral failing requiring an apology tour. It's useful information about which specific relationships and situations draw the most from an already low reserve. And that information becomes valuable in exactly the way Chapter 7's Fragment became valuable. Not as proof of failure, but as data about the actual conditions the recalibration needs in order to hold. The days that go well are not evidence that the work is finished. The days that go badly are not evidence that the work never started. Both are simply data points in a longer process that was never going to move in a straight line. No matter how much the old setting insists that a single bad day proves the whole thing was never real. It wasn't ever real until you decided, on a day exactly like this one, to notice the old pattern moving and interrupt it for half a second longer than the day made comfortable. That half second, repeated enough times on enough bad days, is what eventually starts to change the setting itself, not through force, but through the same slow accumulation of evidence that built the original pattern in the first place. It is a slower kind of progress than anyone would choose if given the option. And it is also the only kind that survives contact with an actual, ordinary, difficult life. The next chapter takes this same fragile new pattern, and puts it in front of the people who know your old one best. Because nothing tests a recalibration quite like a room full of people still expecting the version of you they've always gotten.
Chapter 10. The Room That Knows Your Old Pattern by Heart. You can change alone in a quiet room. The real test happens in front of the people who learned you a long time ago. There's a particular disorientation that arrives the first time you try to hold the recalibrated response from the last few chapters in front of someone who has known the old version of
you for years. Alone, the new pattern felt fragile but real. In the room with them, it suddenly feels like a costume, something you're performing rather than something you are, because the room itself seems to be pulling you back toward the version they've always gotten. This isn't your imagination. Something real is happening, and it has almost nothing to do with your own resolve. Here's the mechanism, stated plainly. Other people don't just witness your patterns, they participate in them, often without knowing it, because relationships settle into equilibrium the way any system does, and equilibrium resists disruption from either side. If you've spent 15 years being the one who overfunctions, who smooths things over, who absorbs the discomfort so nobody else has to, the people around you have built their own responses on top of that expectation, whether or not they ever chose to. Your mother doesn't ask if you're actually fine. She assumes it because you've spent decades training her to. Your partner doesn't check whether a request is too much. They don't have to because you've never once told them it was. The old setting wasn't operating in isolation. It was operating inside a web of other people's expectations, built jointly, over years, without anyone signing anything. This is why recalibrating a pattern alone is genuinely different from recalibrating it in front of the people who know the old version best. It's not that you're weaker in front of them. It's that you're now asking an entire system, not just your own wiring, to accept new information at the same time, and systems built by multiple people resist change with a force no individual willpower was ever built to overcome alone. Notice the distinction this creates, because confusing the two causes real damage. The resistance you feel in a room like this is not proof the new pattern is wrong. It's proof the room was built jointly around the old one, and rooms don't update as fast as individuals do. Trine touched this only briefly, mostly through warnings about the influence of what he called negative thought atmospheres, other people's fear and doubt bleeding into a person trying to hold a steadier state. His framing was somewhat mystical, but the underlying observation was accurate. States are contagious in both directions. A person actively working to hold a recalibrated response can in fact be pulled back toward an old pattern simply by spending enough time in a room built to expect it. The same way a single steady voice in a tense meeting can, just as easily, pull a whole room toward calm. Influence runs both directions. Most people only notice the direction that's currently working against them. Consider a specific, ordinary version of this. You've been practicing quietly, saying what you actually think instead of the managed version the old setting always produced. You try it for the first time at a family dinner, with people who have spent decades getting the accommodating version of you. The words come out. And then something happens that no one intended maliciously. A slight pause, a look passed between two other people at the table, a gentle joke that redirects the conversation before your actual statement gets to land. Nobody did anything wrong exactly, but the room, trained over years to expect a different version of you, absorbed the new information and quietly filed it under exception rather than update. This is the moment worth understanding without bitterness, because bitterness makes the wrong thing the target. The people in that room aren't sabotaging you on purpose most of the time. They're responding to decades of consistent data, the same way you'd expect anyone to. The old you was not a lie. It was real, sustained over years, and the room learned it accurately. Asking a room to instantly recognize and accommodate a new pattern after one dinner is asking more of other people's perception than perception usually delivers. Recalibration in relationship takes repetition.
Exactly the way it took repetition in your own nervous system. Except now the repetition has to register in someone else's expectations too. Here's a distinction worth sitting with directly. Expecting other people to instantly believe your new pattern is different from expecting yourself to keep showing up with it regardless of whether they believe it yet. The first expectation sets you up for disappointment on a timeline you don't control. The second one doesn't. There's a specific danger embedded in this chapter worth naming honestly. Some rooms will never update, not because the recalibration failed, but because the room has a genuine investment in the old pattern continuing. A parent who benefited from your overfunctioning may not, even unconsciously, want you to stop. A friendship built entirely around your availability to absorb someone else's crises may not survive you setting a boundary you've never set before. This is not evidence you did something wrong. It's information about which relationships were actually compatible with the recalibrated version of you, and which ones were quietly dependent on the old one continuing indefinitely. This is where the distinction between a relationship and an arrangement becomes useful. A relationship can tolerate one person changing, because it was built on something more durable than a fixed role. An arrangement, dressed up as a relationship, depends specifically on each person continuing to play their assigned part, and it will resist any change to the script with a force disproportionate to how minor the change actually looks from outside. Learning to tell the difference is not cynicism. It's the same clear-eyed honesty this whole process has required from the very first chapter. None of this means withdrawing from people or treating every relationship as suspect. It means understanding that the resistance you feel in a room is rarely only about you. It's about a system, built jointly over years, being asked to absorb new information faster than systems built by multiple people usually can. Some rooms will catch up, some will take longer than you'd like, and a few, honestly, may never catch up at all, and that information, however uncomfortable, is worth having. There's a specific kind of patience this requires that's different from the patience the earlier chapters asked of you. Chapter 9's patience was aimed inward, at your own depleted days. This patience is aimed outward, at a timeline you don't control and can't accelerate by trying harder. The most useful version of it looks like continuing to show up as the recalibrated version of yourself in a given room, consistently, without needing that room to acknowledge the change as proof it was worth doing. The proof was never going to come from the room. It was always going to come from whether you kept showing up regardless. The next chapter goes further back than any relationship currently in your life, all the way to where this pattern actually started, and asks the question this whole process has been circling since Chapter 4. Not just how the setting works, but where it came from, and why it survived this long in the first place. Chapter 11. The Root That Outlasted the Reason for It. Not a search for someone to blame. A search for the moment the wiring first made sense. Every setting has an origin point, however blurred by time. And this chapter is going back to find it, not to assign fault, but because a pattern this durable rarely explains itself fully until you've located where it actually began. Most people resist this kind of looking, and understandably so. Going back feels like opening a door that stayed shut for good reasons. But the door has been open the entire time, quietly, in the form of every reaction the last 10 chapters have described. This chapter simply asks you to walk through it on purpose instead of being pulled through it sideways, the way it's been happening for years. Start with a distinction that makes this search possible without collapsing into old grief. Looking for the origin of a pattern is not the same as reopening a wound to relive it. It's closer to reading an old case file with fresh eyes, understanding the evidence that produced a verdict, and asking whether that verdict still applies to the person standing here now. The child who built this setting was solving a real problem with the only tools available at the time. The adult reading the file today has different tools,
and possibly a different situation entirely, but can't use them until the original verdict has been located and understood. Here's a way to find it that doesn't require months of excavation. Think of the earliest memory you have of the specific feeling that still shows up today. The tightness from Chapter 8, the vigilance from Chapter 4. Not the first time you can name it intellectually. The first time you can feel it in your body, even faintly, from far enough back that the memory has lost most of its edges. For some people, it's a specific scene. A raised voice from another room. A silence at a dinner table that meant something everyone understood without saying. For others, it's not a scene at all, just a texture, an atmosphere that repeated often enough to become the baseline temperature of an entire childhood, with no single moment standing out because none needed to. Both are equally valid origins. The setting doesn't require a dramatic scene to install itself. It only requires enough repetition. This is worth answering honestly, even if the memory is faint. What is the earliest version you can locate of the exact feeling that still runs the pattern today? Not the story around it, just the feeling. And roughly how old you were when it first became familiar. Trine described the accumulated weight of early impressions using softer, more general language, writing about how the atmosphere a person is raised in shapes the entire tone of their later life. He was gesturing at something true without the precision to name it exactly, which modern understanding of early development now allows. A young nervous system does not evaluate danger the way an adult one does. It doesn't weigh probabilities or consider context. It simply registers what happens repeatedly, and builds a working model of the world from that repetition. A model built for survival, not for accuracy, and definitely not for comfort 40 years later. This is the reason the setting survived so long after the original conditions ended. It was never built with an expiration date because nothing that forms in childhood is built with one. It was built to last, because a child cannot afford a working model of danger that expires the moment circumstances change. Durability was the entire design goal. The cost of that durability, paid decades later by an adult who no longer lives anywhere near the original conditions, was never part of the calculation, because a child's nervous system isn't calculating for the adult's future. It's calculating for survival tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow, until eventually there are enough tomorrows that the pattern simply becomes how a person operates, indistinguishable from personality. Consider what this means about the people who may have contributed to the original conditions, because this is where the search either stays useful or curdles into something that undermines everything the last 10 chapters have built. A parent who was frightened, depleted, or simply repeating a pattern installed in them the exact same way is not, by that fact alone, a villain in this story. They may have been operating from their own uncalibrated setting, installed by their own earlier conditions, in a chain that likely extends back further than anyone in the family has ever traced. This doesn't erase real harm where real harm occurred. It reframes the harm as transmission, rather than as a uniquely personal failure, which turns out to matter enormously for whether the adult doing this search today can hold the findings without collapsing into either blame or shame. Here's the distinction that makes this bearable. Understanding where a pattern was transmitted from is not the same as excusing what it cost you. Both things can be true simultaneously. Someone can have passed you something they never chose to carry themselves, and you can still be the one responsible for what happens with it now that you're the one holding it. There's a specific reason this pattern has survived every previous attempt to address it directly, and it connects back to Chapter 6's account of failed change efforts. You cannot argue a system out of a conclusion it reached through direct, repeated experience. The setting didn't form from an idea. It formed from evidence, gathered the same way any evidence gets gathered, through repetition observed carefully by a system built to notice exactly this kind of thing. Insight alone, no matter how sharp, is not evidence in the currency the setting actually trades in.
This is why understanding your childhood intellectually, which many people accomplish through years of therapy or reading, so rarely dissolves the pattern on its own. The system that built the pattern isn't persuaded by insight. It's only updated by new, repeated, lived evidence, which is exactly what chapters 7 through 9 have been quietly building toward this entire time. This changes what the search in this chapter is actually for. Not resolution, in the sense of a single cathartic realization that ends the pattern's hold. Something more modest and more useful, a clear, honest map of where the wiring came from, so that every subsequent attempt to recalibrate it can be aimed with precision instead of guesswork. You now know, or are close to knowing, what conditions built the setting, and settings built by specific conditions can be updated by conditions built specifically to contradict them, which is a different and far more targeted project than vague general self-improvement ever managed to be. The root goes back further than a single memory, and further than a single household most likely, extending into a chain of transmission that predates you by at least a generation, possibly more. That's not a life sentence. It's context. And context, once actually seen instead of avoided, becomes something you can finally work with directly, instead of fighting blind. The next chapter takes everything located here and asks the harder practical question. Once real progress starts, why does it keep disappearing, and what would it actually take to protect it once you have it? Chapter 12. Why progress disappears, and what actually protects it. You've made real gains before. This chapter is about why they kept vanishing, and what a gain actually needs in order to survive. There's a specific kind of disappointment that hurts more than never trying at all, and it deserves to be named honestly before this chapter moves anywhere else. You've had stretches, real ones, where the recalibration from the last 11 chapters actually held. A few weeks where the old pattern stayed quiet. A season where the new response felt less like effort and more like simply who you were becoming. And then, without any single dramatic cause, it slipped. Not all at once. Gradually, the way a room cools when someone leaves a door open just slightly, so slowly that by the time you notice the temperature has changed, you can't identify the exact moment it started. This is the moment most people conclude that the whole project was fragile from the start, that the gain was never real, only a temporary performance that the old setting eventually reclaimed. That conclusion is understandable, and it is wrong, and getting it wrong here costs more than getting anything else in this process wrong, because it's the conclusion that stops people from trying again at all. Here's the actual mechanism, stated as plainly as the others. A gain is not the same as a structure. A gain is a moment, or a stretch of moments, where the recalibrated response won out over the old setting. A structure is the set of conditions that make winning likely to repeat itself without requiring constant, exhausting vigilance. Most people, once they experience a gain, assume the gain will simply continue on its own momentum, the way a ball keeps rolling once it's been pushed. But a gain without a structure around it behaves less like a rolling ball and more like a candle in an open window. It doesn't fail because the flame was weak. It fails because nothing was ever built to shield it from the conditions that were always going to test it eventually. This distinction is worth holding precisely, because confusing the two is the single most common reason progress collapses. A gain tells you the new pattern is possible. Only a structure tells you it will hold when conditions stop being favorable. Trine wrote about the necessity of what he called steady, deliberate practice, distinguishing it from the more common pattern of enthusiastic starts followed by quiet abandonment. He was right about the shape of the problem, though his solution stayed mostly at the level of willpower, urging persistence without much attention to what actually makes persistence sustainable. The more useful addition, available now, is specific. A structure is not more willpower. It's an external arrangement, built once, deliberately, that reduces how much willpower any given moment requires.
Consider what this looks like concretely, because abstraction is where this chapter's real value gets lost. Someone spends 6 weeks holding a genuinely different pattern in their closest relationship, speaking honestly instead of managing the conversation the old way. The 6 weeks work, and work well enough that both people notice the difference. Then a demanding month arrives at work, sleep gets shorter, and the honest pattern quietly reverts, not from any single failure but from the ordinary erosion of a demanding season. If the only thing holding the new pattern in place was that person's ongoing moment-to-moment vigilance, this reversion was never avoidable. Vigilance is exactly the resource. Chapter 9 already identified as finite and unreliable under exactly these conditions. What was missing wasn't more resolve. It was a structure, a standing weekly check-in with their partner, agreed upon in advance, that didn't depend on either person's depleted willpower to initiate it during the hard month. The structure does the work vigilance can't sustain alone. Here's a question worth sitting with honestly, because the answer usually points directly at what's missing. Think of a gain you've made before that eventually slipped. What structure, if it had existed in advance, would have caught that slip before it became a full reversion? This is where the distinction between motivation and architecture becomes central. Motivation is a feeling, and feelings fluctuate for reasons that have nothing to do with whether the underlying commitment is real. Architecture doesn't fluctuate because it isn't a feeling. It's a fixed arrangement, a scheduled time, a specific person who has agreed to ask a specific question. A physical environment set up in advance to make the old pattern slightly harder to fall into, and the new one slightly easier to reach. Most failed change efforts weren't failures of motivation at all. They were efforts that depended entirely on motivation, with no architecture built to catch the inevitable days when motivation wasn't available. Consider what architecture actually looks like in practice, because it's rarely dramatic. It might be as small as writing down, at the start of a good week, exactly what a bad week tends to look like for you, specifically, so that when it arrives you recognize it as the familiar pattern instead of a unique crisis requiring you to reason from scratch under the worst possible conditions. It might be a single trusted person given explicit permission in advance to name what they're seeing, so the observation doesn't have to wait for your own depleted awareness to catch it first. It might be nothing more than a recurring time in the week set aside to check honestly whether the old setting has quietly crept back into a specific relationship or routine, before the creeping becomes a full reversal. Notice what all of these examples share. None of them require you to feel strong in the moment they're needed. That's precisely the point. Architecture is built during a season of strength, specifically, so it can function during a season without it. There's a particular grief worth naming honestly here, because pretending it away doesn't help. Building architecture means admitting, in advance, that a future version of you will have less resolve than the version building the structure today. That admission can feel like a failure of faith in yourself, and it is the opposite. It's the most respectful thing you can do for the person you'll be on a depleted Tuesday 8 months from now. Someone who deserves a system built by a clearer-headed version of you, rather than being asked to reconstruct the entire recalibration from scratch alone, at the exact moment they have the least capacity to do it. This is also where the earlier chapters connect directly to this one. The fragment from Chapter 7, the resistance from Chapter 8, the bad days from Chapter 9, the room from Chapter 10, the root from Chapter 11. All of it was necessary groundwork, but none of it, by itself, protects a gain once it's been made. Only architecture does that. Understanding is where this process started. Structure is what makes understanding durable enough to survive an ordinary difficult month without collapsing back into the pattern it took 11 chapters to see clearly. The gains you've made before were not failures of character. They were gains without scaffolding, exposed to exactly the conditions scaffolding exists to survive. The next chapter takes this same idea further, asking not just what protects a single gain, But what happens once enough protected gains accumulate into something less fragile than a pattern? Something closer to who you're actually becoming. Chapter 13. The point where a pattern becomes a person. At some point, you stop doing the new thing and start being someone for whom the old thing no longer fits. There's a shift that happens somewhere past the halfway point of any real recalibration. Quiet enough that most people don't notice it arriving until they look back and realize it already happened. Early on, every instance of the new response required a decision. You noticed the old pattern moving. You remembered the fragment from Chapter 7. You held the resistance from Chapter 8. You leaned on the architecture from Chapter 12. And the new response happened because you made it happen, deliberately, one choice at a time. Then at some point, a version of the new response shows up without any of that machinery being visible. It's just there, already in motion before you've consciously decided anything. That's not luck. And it's not the same thing as the earlier gains. That's the moment a pattern starts becoming identity. Here's the distinction worth holding with real precision, because the two get confused constantly, and the confusion costs people years. A habit is something you do. It requires a decision, however automatic that decision has become through repetition. And it can be undone by a single sufficiently disruptive circumstance, because it was never anything more than a well-worn choice. Identity is different. Identity is not something you do. It's the thing generating what you do, underneath the level where decisions even register as decisions. When a pattern crosses from habit into identity, you stop needing to remember to act it out. You simply act from it. The way you don't decide to speak in your native language before every sentence. It's not a choice you're making anymore. It's the shape the choosing itself has taken. This matters because it explains something that otherwise looks mysterious about long-term change. Early recalibration is exhausting precisely because every instance costs willpower, the finite resource named back in Chapter 6. If that exhaustion never lessened, no one could sustain a real change for more than a few months. And yet clearly some people do sustain change for decades. The reason isn't that they found a deeper reserve of willpower than everyone else. The reason is that somewhere along the way, the pattern stopped requiring willpower at all, because it had migrated from behavior into identity. And identity runs without needing to be switched on each time. Notice what this means about the earlier chapters' machinery, the fragment, the architecture, the repeated evidence stacked against the old setting. None of that work disappears once identity forms. It's what built the identity in the first place. The scaffolding doesn't get discarded when the building can finally stand on its own. It gets quietly absorbed into the structure it made possible. Trine wrote about this transition using the language of a person coming into full realization of their true nature, treating the shift almost as a spiritual arrival, a permanent state achieved once and then simply inhabited. The more accurate picture, informed by everything the last 12 chapters have built, is less dramatic and more durable. The shift isn't a single arrival. It's a threshold crossed gradually, through the accumulation of exactly the repeated, protected gains Chapter 12 described, until enough evidence has stacked up that the old setting no longer has a majority vote in how you respond. It doesn't disappear entirely. It becomes a minority position, occasionally audible, rarely in charge. Consider what this looks like in a specific lived moment, because the abstraction only becomes useful once it's grounded. Someone who spent years managing conflict by disappearing, going quiet, offering the version of themselves least likely to provoke further tension, finds themselves in a disagreement that would once have triggered the old pattern instantly, and notices only afterward that they stayed present through the entire conversation without once deciding to. There was no moment of catching the old pattern and choosing against it, the way there would have been a year earlier. There was just presence, uninterrupted. because the disappearing response no longer had anywhere to attach itself. That's not a bigger version of the same willpower. That's a different person occupying the same situation. Here's a question worth sitting with honestly, because the answer reveals exactly where you are in this process. Think of a recent moment when the new response happened before you noticed yourself choosing it.
If you can find even one, that's not a coincidence. That's the threshold, crossed quietly, without an announcement. There's a specific danger worth naming at this stage, because it tends to show up exactly when things are going well. Once a pattern starts feeling like identity, there's a temptation to believe the work is finished, that the old setting has been permanently retired and can be safely forgotten. This isn't accurate, and believing it costs people the very gains they've built. The old setting doesn't get deleted. It gets outvoted. Under enough stress, enough depletion, enough of the exact conditions that originally installed it, an old, mostly retired pattern can still surface. And when it does, it's easy to mistake that single reappearance for proof that nothing ever really changed. It's not proof of that. It's proof that identity, like anything built from repetition, still requires the occasional reminder of why the new pattern exists, especially under the specific conditions the old one was built to handle. This is where the distinction between solitude and loneliness becomes useful again, applied slightly differently than Chapter 3 first introduced it. Loneliness is the old setting's version of being alone, a state defined by absence, by what's missing, by vigilance against a threat that might arrive at any moment. Solitude, the version this recalibration has been building toward, is presence with yourself that requires nothing external to complete it. The shift from one to the other isn't a mood. It's the clearest possible marker of which setting is actually running the room when no one else is there to perform for. There's a practical way to recognize this threshold that doesn't rely on introspection alone, since introspection can be talked into almost anything. Look at what your body does in the moment right after a hard situation ends, not during it. During it, adrenaline can carry almost anyone through almost anything, old pattern or new. It's the minutes afterward that tell the real story. The old setting, even when it manages to hold during the event itself, tends to leave a long tail of replay, rehearsal, and second-guessing once the pressure lifts. Identity doesn't leave that tail. It lets the moment close when the moment is actually over. You are not the same person who started Chapter 1, noticing static you couldn't yet name. You are also not finished, not in the sense of having arrived at a fixed, permanent state immune to every future test. What you are, if the last 12 chapters have done their work, is someone for whom the old pattern is no longer the default. It's a visitor now, occasionally audible, no longer the host. That's not a small distinction. That's the actual, practical meaning of everything this process has been building toward since the very first page. The next chapter takes every piece built so far: the static, the denial, the pattern, the mechanism, the cost, the failed attempts, the fragment, the resistance, the bad days, the room, the route, the architecture, and this threshold, and asks what it looks like once all of it operates together, not as separate lessons, but as a single coherent way of moving through a life. Chapter 14. All the pieces, now one system. Not a summary, a single working thing, made from parts that used to operate separately. There's a particular quiet that arrives once the pieces stop feeling like separate lessons and start operating as one system, and it's worth describing precisely, because it doesn't announce itself the way any of the earlier breakthroughs did. Chapter 1's static isn't gone exactly, but it no longer requires interpretation every time it appears, because you already know what it's pointing to. Chapter 3's reversal of causation, outside in versus inside out, isn't something you have to remember mid-conversation anymore. It's simply how you now expect things to work. This chapter isn't introducing anything new. It's naming what happens when everything already built stops needing to be assembled consciously every time it's called on. Here's the distinction worth understanding about what consolidation actually is, because it's easy to mistake for something smaller than it is. Early in this process, each piece functioned as an isolated tool, reached for individually, in sequence, often with real effort. Notice the static. Question the explanation. Name the pattern. Locate the setting. Calculate the cost. Understand why past attempts failed. Find the fragment. Hold the resistance. Survive the bad day. Navigate the room. Trace the route. Build the architecture. Cross the threshold. Used one at a time in the right order, these were already enough to produce real change. But a system is not the same as a sequence of tools used well. A system is what happens when the tools stop needing to be selected individually, because they've fused into a single, standing capacity that responds to whatever the moment actually requires, without needing to consult a mental checklist first. Consider what this looks like in an ordinary moment, because the abstraction only means something once it's grounded in something specific. A difficult message arrives, the kind that would once have triggered the entire old pattern instantly and completely. In the early chapters, meeting this well-required conscious sequence, notice the static. Question the first explanation that arrives. Remember the fragment. Hold the resistance. Maybe even reach for the architecture built for exactly this kind of moment. Now, further along, something different happens. The message arrives, and the response that shows up already contains all of that, compressed into something closer to instinct. Not because the individual steps stopped mattering, but because they've stopped needing to happen sequentially, in view, one at a time. They happen together, instantly, the way a skilled driver doesn't consciously separate checking the mirror from signaling from turning the wheel. The separate motions were once effortful and distinct. Now they're one motion, and asking which part came first misses what actually happened. This is worth stating plainly, because it clarifies what consolidation is and isn't. Consolidation doesn't mean the work stops. It means the work stops requiring conscious assembly every time, because assembly has already happened enough times to become structure rather than effort. Trine gestured toward this integration when he wrote about a person's whole life eventually falling into alignment with their deeper current, not as separate corrected behaviors but as a single, coherent way of being. He lacked the specific architecture the last 13 chapters have built to explain how that integration actually happens, but the observation itself holds. A person doesn't heal one relationship, one habit, one reaction at a time forever, in isolation from every other piece. At some point, the pieces start informing each other. The steadiness built in one part of a life starts showing up, uninvited but welcome, in parts of the life that were never directly worked on. The person who learned to hold a difficult conversation with a partner discovers, without quite planning it, that a difficult conversation with a colleague has also gotten easier, because the underlying capacity being built was never really about the specific relationship. It was about the setting itself, and the setting doesn't distinguish between contexts the way the earlier, more effortful work did. Here's a question worth sitting with, because the answer usually reveals exactly how far this consolidation has actually progressed. Has progress in one area of your life started showing up, uninvited, in an area you never deliberately worked on? If so, that's not a coincidence. That's the system, not the sequence, doing the work now. There's a specific, quiet marker of this stage worth naming honestly, because it looks like nothing from the outside and means everything from the inside. It's the absence of a particular kind of narration. Early in this process, there was almost always an internal voice tracking the work, noticing the pattern, naming the mechanism, congratulating the small win, worrying about the next test. That voice was necessary. It was how the earlier chapters got built at all. But somewhere in consolidation, the voice gets quieter. Not because the awareness disappeared,
but because awareness stopped needing to announce itself constantly to function. A person deep in genuine competence at anything, a craft, a skill, a way of being, stops narrating the competence and simply exercises it. The silence isn't complacency, it's what integration actually sounds like from the inside. This is also the stage where the distinction between discipline and fidelity, first introduced back in Chapter 6, reaches its fullest expression. Discipline was necessary to get here. It was the willpower spent holding a new response against an old setting that hadn't yet updated. Fidelity is what discipline becomes once the setting itself has changed enough that holding the new response no longer requires force. Nobody arrives at fidelity by skipping discipline. But fidelity is the destination discipline was always working toward, even when it didn't feel like it during the exhausting early stretches. Notice what this means practically. If the new pattern still requires constant, effortful vigilance in most situations, consolidation hasn't fully arrived yet. And that's simply accurate information, not a failure. If it started to require less vigilance in more and more situations, without you deciding to relax your guard, that's the system taking over from the sequence. None of this means vigilance disappears entirely, or that the old setting has been permanently retired in some final, guaranteed way. Chapter 13 already named that danger clearly. What's different now is the texture of the whole thing. A life built from 13 separate corrections, held together by ongoing effort, is fragile in a specific way, vulnerable at every seam where one correction meets the next. A life that has consolidated into a single system doesn't have those seams anymore, or has far fewer of them, because the pieces were never really separate to begin with. They were always one thing, wearing different names depending on which chapter happened to be describing them. You are, at this point, closer to whole than you were at the start of this process, not because every piece has been perfected, but because the pieces have finally started operating as one thing instead of 13 separate projects requiring separate attention. That wholeness doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need anyone else to confirm it's real. It's simply there now, quieter than anything that came before it, and solid in a way effort alone never quite manages to be. The final chapter closes the loop this entire process opened on its very first page. The tension planted in the hook before you knew any of these 15 chapters existed. What you've built here was never really about any single pattern. It was about something the opening pages promised without naming directly, and it's time finally to name it. Chapter 15. What remains after the time runs out? Not a question anymore, an answer, arrived at the only way an answer like this can arrive, by living toward it. Go back to the beginning, to the 4 paragraphs that opened this whole process, before you knew what any of it would ask of you. A hand reaching for a phone before the eyes had even opened, a morning cast before a single breath had been taken on purpose, and underneath it, a line meant to sit unresolved for as long as it took to earn its answer. The question was never what you do with your time. It was what you do with what's left of you after the time runs out. That line was not a riddle designed to be clever. It was a diagnosis, delivered before you had the instruments to read it. Most people spend their entire lives answering the wrong question, the one about time, managing it, optimizing it, mourning how little of it remains, while the actual question, the one about what's left of a person once the hours have taken their toll, goes unasked for decades. You now have the instruments, 14 chapters of them, and the answer, finally, is available in a form simple enough to hold in one hand. What's left of you after the time runs out is not a fixed quantity, drained a little more each day until nothing remains. That was the old settings theory, the one installed in Chapter 4, the one that treated depletion as inevitable and vigilance as the only available response to a world that kept taking. The actual answer is different, and it's the answer this entire journey was built to deliver.
What's left of you after the time runs out depends entirely on which setting was running while the time was being spent. Spend a day from the old pattern, reacting instead of responding, managing instead of meaning it, and the hours leave you emptier than they found you, regardless of how much or how little actually happened. Spend a day from the recalibrated one, and the same number of hours, the same demands, the same difficult conversations leave something behind instead of taking it. Not because the day was easier. Because the person moving through it was finally the same person at the end of it that they were at the start. This is the thing the woman with the phone, 3 inches from the nightstand, thumb already moving, could not have known in that first paragraph. She thought her exhaustion was about the phone, about the noise, about a life too full to manage. It was never about the noise. It was about a setting installed so early and so thoroughly that she mistook its output for her own personality, the way anyone mistakes a thermostat's number for the actual temperature of a room they've lived in their whole life. You have spent this entire process learning to read that thermostat instead of just living inside whatever number it happened to be set to. That is the whole of what changed. Not your circumstances, not your time. The setting itself, examined, understood, protected, and finally allowed to update. Trine, writing more than a century ago, reached for language about a person's connection to something larger than themselves, a current running beneath ordinary awareness that most people spend their lives disconnected from without ever noticing the disconnection. Strip away the language of his era, and what remains is exactly what these 15 chapters have built, piece by piece, without asking you to believe in anything you couldn't verify against your own life. The static was real. The denial was functional, not moral. The pattern had a name, and the name was a direction of causation, running backward from what you'd always assumed. The setting had an anatomy, installed early, for reasons that made complete sense at the time. The cost was real and compounding. The previous attempts failed for a specific locatable reason. The fragment was already there, waiting to be taken seriously instead of dismissed as luck. The resistance, when it came, was confirmation, not contradiction. The bad days revealed the actual unit of progress, smaller and more honest than perfection. The room required patience that had nothing to do with your own resolve. The route explained the durability without excusing the cost. The architecture protected what effort alone could never hold. And somewhere in the crossing from habit to identity, the thing you'd been building stopped requiring you to build it anymore. Here is the answer, finally, to the question planted before you knew it was a question. What's left of you after the time runs out is whoever was actually running the moments while the time was passing. Change who's running the moments, and you change what remains, without needing to change a single hour of the schedule that produces them. This is not a permanent state achieved once and then guaranteed forever. Nothing in the last 14 chapters promised that, and this one won't start now. The old setting still exists, quieter, outvoted, occasionally audible on the hardest days, the way Chapter 13 already told you honestly it would be. But you are no longer the person who mistook its voice for the only voice available. You know now what the static actually meant. You know the difference between a circumstance and a pattern, between reacting and responding, between discipline that runs out and fidelity that doesn't, between a loneliness that fears an empty room and a solitude that doesn't need it filled. The coffee from that first chapter, the cup going cold across the table while she read the same message 3 times without answering, was never really about whether she'd respond to the text. It was about whether she'd finally sit down long enough to notice what was actually happening underneath the noise of an ordinary Tuesday. You have done that now, 15 chapters deep, in a way that first chapter could only gesture toward without yet earning the right to explain. What's left of you after the time runs out is not a smaller version of who you started as. It is, if this process has done its work, the first honest version you've had access to in years, the one that was always underneath the static,
waiting for the noise to quiet down enough to be heard. It was never far away. It was never gone. It was only ever waiting for you to stop asking the wrong question long enough to hear the right one answer itself. There is one last distinction worth carrying forward, past the final page of this particular process. A conclusion is something you arrive at once and file away. A practice is something you return to, deliberately, for as long as you're alive to return to it. Everything built across these 15 chapters was never meant to be the first kind. The static will come back sometimes. The old setting will get a vote again, on a hard enough day, in a room that hasn't caught up yet. That was never the failure condition. The failure condition was always mistaking the noise for the whole truth, the way it happened before any of this started. You won't make that mistake in the same way again, not because you're finished, but because you finally know what you're listening for. That answer is yours now, not borrowed, not explained to you from outside, arrived at the only way it could be, by walking the whole distance yourself, and recognizing only at the end that you were the one who found it.